Hi, Carrie. How are you?
Hi, Jamie. Great, thanks. Lovely to see you. Lovely to meet you virtually.
Yeah, you too. I've read so much of your work, so it's great to have a proper
Thank you.
conversation and glad to have you coming from sunny Glasgow today. So,
Exactly. At least it's not raining. And
yeah.
I'm really glad to learn more about sentientism, which is something that, as I said to you earlier, I hadn't heard of before I heard you on our hen house, that wonderful one of the many other fabulous kind of podcasts that are around at the moment. And yeah, I learned a lot. Of course, I know what the argument about sentientism is, but I hadn't heard of it as a kind of philosophy or worldview or another ism. So that's really interesting too. And we're looking forward to exploring a bit more what
Yeah, that
that
would be
means and how it relates to what my own kind of ethics are.
sounds good. And the center of this really is about your personal philosophical story, but I can't resist, pushing my agenda, of course. So, yeah, it'd be good to have that
Of course.
build that into the conversation and see how well it aligns. And this is a series of conversations, and thanks for listening and watching to this series about the two deepest philosophical questions: what's real and what matters. And the essence of this sentientism idea is super simple. It's just evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when it comes to thinking about what's real, it suggests we should take a naturalistic approach. And when it comes to what matters, the clue is in the name. We should bound our compassion, our moral consideration based on sentience. Any being that has the capacity to experience suffering or flourishing. But I'm talking to people who disagree and agree with that philosophy. So again, it'd be great to hear your story and see what you think of the idea and see how well you fit.
I suspect in my case, it's not so much disagree as agree broadly, but also have come to it from a different direction.
Yeah.
And so might have some differences in terms of perhaps some definitions and priorities and so on and so forth. But
yeah. That would be good to explore.
Yeah.
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 But before
Yeah.
we get to those two deep questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for people who don't know you already?
Okay, I guess I'm going to start from the start. And one of the reasons I'm going to do this, I don't know if anyone has had the opportunity to do this yet on your podcast, but there's something that those of us who were born in what is today Canada, the United States, parts of the Americas do now, and it's quite recent to me because I don't live in Canada anymore. But that is to acknowledge the territory and the land where we were born, and it wasn't ours, and in my case, that it was my English and Scottish and Irish and German settler ancestors who settled that land. So I was born in Toronto, and Toronto is located on the traditional territory of several Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it's covered by Treaty 13 of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I say this, as I said, now following a very common convention in Canada about both people with settler and other migrant and also Indigenous heritages. But I also say it as a way of acknowledging that this is not something that I grew up with being terribly knowledgeable about or aware of my positioning, my situation, not only as a white person, but also as someone from a settler background.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about this because I think I'm quite autobiographically minded as well as biographically minded. I'm trained as a historian. And I'll say more about that in a moment. I worked as a professional academic historian for 20 years. But I often think about what is it that I got from my childhood and what is it that I didn't get, not as a way of laying blame, but as a way of kind of understanding where I came to be, where I am now. And as I said, I was born in Toronto, what is today Canada. I grew up in a small city not far from there. My parents were social democrats. They were agnostic, and I'm kind of anticipating a question I know you ask your guests about the religious background. They were both from Protestant Christian families, but neither one of them had been raised particularly with religion. But I guess what the strongest thing I got from my upbringing was a real sense of kind of social justice and commitment to activism. And I guess a kind of what you might now call a form of democratic socialism. So not revolutionary socialism, but a real emphasis on practice. And my parents I was dragged along to election campaigns and rallies. And my parents were very active in setting up a food co-op when I was a kid.
You were carrying a placard as a toddler.
Absolutely. I have T-shirts. My father ran for council for the New Democratic Party and so on and so forth. So I really had a very political upbringing. And so in addition to being super committed to community and activism, very much, I'd say that my father was perhaps what I might call now a kind of organic intellectual, that Gramscian kind of figure. Grew up on a farm, did go eventually to university, but was the first person in his family who went to university, and actually ended up studying agriculture because he wasn't interested in agriculture, but his family were only able to send him to school if he was willing to study that. And that led him into his political activism. He, as a young man, started union organizing among farm workers in Western Canada. And he and my mother met at a political convention. So it was politics right from my youth. But as I said, and also a very intellectual upbringing, but I guess the idea of applied ideas. We didn't sit around talking about abstract ideas or metaphysics or does God exist? There was no God in my household. They weren't atheists, I don't think. They weren't anti-God. God was not an issue. And they were also environmentalists, my parents. So great hikers, bird watchers. Unfortunately, I didn't learn anything from either of my parents about bird watching, which I now massively regret when I walk my dog in wonderful nature areas and wish that I could identify the calls of anything other than a woodpecker, which is such an obvious noise that anyone who can hear can identify it.
Yeah.
And so I picked up those kinds of values very strongly. Interestingly, what I didn't pick up was a sense of any kind of commitment to animals, certainly farm animals. I find this fascinating now, and it's a slight source of regret. My father's been dead for about 20 years, and wouldn't I love to speak to him now about his relationships with the farm animals he grew up with. I just don't know. We ate meat. I didn't know any vegetarians when I was growing up. And I imagine if I ever had the opportunity to meet them, it would have been they would have been presented as hippie types.
Yeah.
I didn't particularly grow up with any kind of feminism. I think in a way, my mother was pre-second wave and I was post-second wave. And also didn't grow up with any kind of awareness that the land I grew up in had been, settled by Europeans and effectively genocide had been committed against Indigenous people.
I mean, was that just completely absent from the curriculum and from the conversations people had?
Because my father was an activist and because he had a lot of political connections, he did talk about meeting with Indigenous leaders as part of that. And so I'm sure he was much more involved in questions about Indigenous rights. But we're talking about the kind of 70s and 80s in which the level of kind of awareness and activism beyond Indigenous communities was unfortunately very limited. And it was just something for which we're all responsible, the 96% of the population that's not Indigenous. And so I think probably in retrospect, my father in particular, because of his political background, it was certainly not a priority for him because I never heard him speak about it a great deal, but it's something he gave some thought to. But it was this period of reconciliation that Canada has experienced in the early 21st century. So I say this because I find it fascinating to think back on the ways in which we learn as children about, what matters in the world. And it's interesting because the way you've put it, I think is really interesting. And that the question of two questions, what's real and what matters. And another question I often find, and I would say in many ways, is the one that keeps me up at night, is what we're responsible for. And who we're responsible to. Because I'm not quite satisfied with the idea that we're responsible for and to everyone, because it becomes overwhelming and it becomes a bit too godlike to me. And I think which is not. So that's the other thing. And I think that I would say that as I've got older and thought more and more about that question of those questions about what matters and to whom am I responsible and what my priorities are, in a way, it's supposed to extend it out a great deal to include other than human animals and the other than human world in a more active way, certainly to include other than human animals. And I would say particularly farmed animals, but not only farmed animals. And also narrowed down, not in the sense of that I've given up on Europe. I still live in Europe. I insist, even though we're not technically in the European Union.
Absolutely, I'm with you on that.
Europe is my home in many ways, but also, I've focused, if not narrowed, more on this question of my own responsibility to the original peoples of what is today Canada. And so those are kind of things that I would say that have been happening for me for the last, say, 6 or 7 years, 10 years. And in the middle of all that, I guess my biggest kind of political influence was that broad school of thought and activism we would call feminism. That, in many ways, has been the thing that from my early university days at the University of Toronto when I was 19, 20, I did a women's studies degree next to a history degree. I think I would say now I probably did one practical thing, that was the history. And the second thing, which was women's studies, which was the political, the thing that drove me and still does in many ways for the next 30, 35 years.
That's a a great introduction to your life, and some of the themes we'll come back to in the conversation as well.
Yeah.
But I guess, so you describe yourself as you are an academic, you're an activist, obviously you're an author as well with your many articles and blogs and your book, Veganism, Sex and Politics as well. Is that how you sum yourself up now?
Well, it's interesting. I would probably not call myself an academic now, because I don't work as a professional academic anymore. I did for 20 years, but it's massively influenced me. And I suppose I would call myself an intellectual, independent scholar, and so on. But actually, leaving my professional academic life was an incredibly liberating thing for me on all sorts of levels, professionally, politically, personally. So I'm not, but I have had the enormous privilege of having a PhD and working for 20 years in a pretty solid academic job. So I can't throw that off, nor do I have any interest in doing so. But yeah, it certainly has freed me up. Not having that pressure of a full-time academic career has really freed me up to do a lot more kind of day-to-day activism and practical stuff. I won't lie. I found one of the great frustrations about being an academic was that it just took up so much of my time and so much of my energy, including all the changes in academia today and the kind of increasing, for lack of better words, neoliberalism, managerialism, the admin load. And I just thought, I started to have a bit of an ethical crisis about it. I thought, really, I'm on this earth for a limited period of time. I have these ideas. Academia has given me the luxury of studying and thinking and talking to people. And God forbid that I would waste this precious resource in endless meetings about, who knows, about library requisitions and impact studies. And I got fed up with it. Yeah. So that was really great, actually, to leave. And now I earn a living as a translator. I worked in Spanish history and Latin American history. So I earn a living as a translator and editor. And I continue to write a lot. And as you said, I wrote this book on veganism a couple of years ago, which tried to bring in those interests in that deep engagement with feminism and feminist theory and activism, and also with queer politics and this kind of newfound passion for veganism. And I think there's in many ways never a better time to work out some of the key questions that kind of bother us or nag at us than to write a book. A book is, if you can make the time and the space and have the money to support yourself through the process of writing a book, it's a great way of working out some key issues, which you can do bit by bit through articles and chapters and stuff. But
just forces you to crystallize and negotiate and really think through.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that was really great and a really important way of taking me, because also in terms of my writing, I became less and less interested in writing for academic journals, academic audiences. I still read a lot of academic work. I learn a lot from it. I enjoy it. But again, getting back to this kind of activist academic in me was just thinking, I want to speak to a wider audience. I want to write in a language, a grammar, a vocabulary, a style that is accessible.
Get out there and make a difference.
And captivating to a wider audience. Some academics are quite good at that, but a lot of academic writing, I'm sure, dug into a lot of philosophy, as you do in this podcast, is very dry, to put it mildly. I think one of the great things about animal rights philosophy is some of the people who are most influential are really good writers, and they have the ability to capture people with their writing. And I think that's an ethical question.
There's something about this field that I think makes most academics, or many academics who are engaged in it, into activists, because the moral imperative is so strong and overwhelming, they almost can't help themselves. I was just in a conference organized by the University of Kent last week that was explicitly bringing researchers and activists together, and it was wonderful. The sparks were flying, because even the academics are actively involved in wanting to go out and make a difference as well, and the activists were hungry for the research and the ideas. It was
and I think, as a not a total outsider, but a kind of insider, but now who's looking at academia partially from the outside, the impression I had when I was just starting to leave and getting myself into animal studies and making some connections with people who are doing what is today animal studies. There's an international organization called Minding Animals. I don't know if you've come across them, but they do an international conference every few years. And I went to the one in Mexico City about 3.5 years ago. I think that's the last one they were able to have before the pandemic. And I could sense there that there was this kind of energy and urgency of the academic work that reminded me a bit what like feminism was when I started doing my women's studies degree in the 1980s. And what I feel that after a few decades of kind of professionalization, a political movement starts to run out of a bit of that steam, and you get people who are professionals, literally professional feminists, which is a good thing for universities, but I'm not sure it's a great thing for feminism as a political movement. That would be a controversial statement, to say the least. But I really felt that kind of urgency and had some fascinating conversations with academics in animal studies, not the least because the vast majority of the ones that I've come across are vegan.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you would do animal studies and make a career out of that, while at the same time eating the bodies of the creatures that you're, whose lives you're somehow benefiting from through your work and pay, that you just don't have time for that argument at all. So all of the animal studies conferences I've gone to, it's too bad because the Kent one, of course, was online, so you won't have got to see this. But if you haven't, you probably noticed that the food is usually vegan, which is fantastic. And it's no questions. They don't even bother saying, we're not going to apologize for this. Clearly, most people are going to be vegan. If you're not, you can deal with it.
Absolutely.
Not a sacrifice.
And you've already shared some hints about the context you grew up in, because I frame it in a fairly simplistic point of view about either a naturalistic worldview that's grounded in understanding the universe imperfectly through evidence and reason, or some form of supernatural or revealed worldview that might be more religious or spiritual. So you mentioned that you grew up in a context that was agnostic, and there wasn't really a sense of deities or religion as a real force of thinking in your lives, and it didn't seem to have an influence in your development of your ethics. Is that something that holds with you today? Would you describe yourself as having a naturalistic scientific sort of worldview, or are there any elements of sort of spiritual mysticism or anything else?
Absolutely. Those times that I have made a bit more space in my life for what I would call spiritualism, including thinking about powers and beings who are not part of the natural world, I've really valued. Sometimes because of the age and the culture I grew up in, those have been at festivals, doing substances and having long walks and seeing trees turn into dragons and things like that, which is wonderful. And I am actually, I'm laughing at this, but I'm a huge believer in that, actually. And one of the other things I do with my activism is look into the question of drug reform, because I think that the way that our contemporary society in the West approaches all drugs other than alcohol, it robs us of the histories of that relationship between everything from cannabis and mushrooms to all sorts of other herbs and plants, and the ways our bodies work in the world. And I have a huge amount of time for people who look into that and have used their own bodies as experiments. And I am actually a firm believer that one of the many routes to spirituality and to mystical experiences is through using different drugs, whether those are natural or other kind of chemical substances. But that hasn't been the focus of my experience. But it has helped me at times to realize that there is something mysterious. And I'm in a weird kind of way rationally and intellectually committed to the idea of mystery. And I have a great deal of admiration for people who have a strong religious faith. What I have very little time for and patience for, and I have less every day, is for institutional religions. That's the historian in me. I've just, again, the evidence. I don't see the evidence that, let's just stick with Christianity, the Protestant and the Catholic churches. I just don't see the evidence the institutions themselves have, on balance, been positive influences. I see their complicity with colonialism. I see their complicity with their patriarchal institutions. I don't see why I should think that a minister or priest has any more moral authority than you or I or anyone else. I think we get moral authority through experience, through study, through wisdom, through a commitment to learning and listening to others. Reading the Bible may be one way. And I think that there are religious leaders who, often local leaders, and I've studied a bit of that phenomenon when I looked at Franco, Spain, and saw how in some parts of the country, local priests, for example, were absolutely instrumental in helping people to counter a very authoritarian, violent regime. So they were acting like local advocates for people. So, of course, there are lots of good Christians, practicing Christians, people go to church. But the institutions themselves, I have almost completely lost respect for altogether.
How much more do we need to see?
Yeah, and I think, just getting back to what I started this conversation with, I don't know if you followed the news in Canada last month, and increasingly the remains of children who were at these residential schools, which are really prisons genocidal prisons throughout the 20th century back into the 19th have been found.
Awful.
And one Canadian bishop went so far as to say he felt like the Catholic Church was being persecuted by being asked to give an apology. This is just, he may not be representative, but unfortunately none of the Canadian churches has particularly come forth. Apparently there are theological reasons why Catholic bishops in particular can't apologize, because the church can't sin. And I don't live in that world in which sin exists. I just see sin as being a form of evil. And I do believe very strongly in institutional accountability and institutional oppression. So that makes no sense to me that an institution wouldn't be able to be held accountable. But unfortunately, it confirms an already very strong belief that the institutions, religious institutions themselves, are seriously wanting ethically.
Yeah. And I think there's, just to play back through some of the themes you've touched on there, that sense of something transcendent and mystery that many people do find access to through psychedelics or something similar, or through a religious experience. In a way, I think I feel many of those things in a purely naturalistic point of view, because my mystery comes from just not understanding everything, and there may be things that we will never know. And a proper naturalistic worldview needs to always have uncertainty at its heart, because that's how you improve, because you're always open to learning new evidence and new ideas. So I guess that's my form of mystery. It's very much a sort of scientific naturalistic mystery. But there's also an emotional side to that as well, about this, broad range of experiences, a sense of connectedness, a sense of all of us being one, which I find through just an partial understanding of physics, right? I don't really need any magic or any supernatural or spiritual or soul concepts to feel what I think people feel. And I think in the psychedelic experience, some people, and I haven't really experimented with those things myself, but I think some people go through those experiences and they get a very strong sense that it's given them a completely different understanding about the nature of reality itself, that there are realms or things out there that they hadn't believed were real anymore. My personal view is that I think those experiences are telling us much more about the plasticity and the range of potential experiences and the wonder of neural processing that's going on in our minds, and how that's affected by drugs and chemical combinations. So I think it's much more about our own experience than it is through dimensions into some alternate reality. But
I think you may.
But I think there's a lot of commonality there still.
Yeah, and I think it may be a false binary, this idea that we have our bodies and then there's something out there, and whether that be the material otherness, the material world and other beings that are other to us on the one hand, or the spiritual world, which is also other to us, and then we connect through it. I think that most people are looking in some way, I believe this, for ways to make connections, and how those connections are made, to whom or what they're made. I think there's a lot of fluidity there. And for some people, it is a very strong belief in what they would call God. And that's not what it is for me. But as I said, I have a great deal of respect for that. And even if I don't share it. Yeah.
And you came on to, so part of the reason I like to ask these two questions of what's real and what matters is I'm interested in, I guess my preferred approach is this naturalistic way of understanding the world in evidence and reason, developing beliefs that are probabilistic and provisional and prudent, never perfectly right, but just trying to get less wrong over time. And one of the reasons I prefer that approach is because I think we're more likely to develop an accurate understanding of the universe if we engage with it honestly, acknowledging our own limitations and being skeptical of our own reasoning all the time. So it's just more likely to be less wrong than a revealed or a supernatural set of beliefs. But in a way, just as important for me is how we link on to the implications for morality. And your points there about the influence institutional religion, I think, is really interesting, because there are some supernatural beliefs that can be harmless or maybe even positive, right? So there's a rich theme of compassion that flows through most of the world's religions. And as you've already hinted at, I think the vast majority of religious people feel that compassion personally, and that feeds through their morality. But one of the other difficulties with the supernatural worldview is it can actually warp ethics in a dangerous way as well. And I guess that's partly why I'm proposing that we, don't just have a broad universal compassion, but we also take a naturalistic approach, is partly to hedge against that risk that supernatural beliefs can undermine our universal compassion. And you've already talked about a few examples there that I think do instantiate pretty strongly in many religious institutions, where the morality is driven more by obedience than it is by compassion. And that flows through into the behavior of the leaders of many churches in these crises, very clearly putting the deity that I don't think exists, the church and the church leaders as a higher priority, often the only priority, and thereby finding it quite easy to disregard victims, ordinary people. And as you've said as well, there aren't many institutions. If you imagine a corporation that was explicitly sexist or homophobic or covered up institutional abuse on a global scale, if Google or Apple or Amazon, were found to do these things, you can imagine the uproar that there would be, rightfully. But there's something
Demands
about
for accountability.
Yeah, but there's something about
absolutely,
religious institutions that seems to give them in our current society a sort of invincible force field that means you can get away with ethics that just would not be allowed in a more modern ethical world.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm not exactly an expert in Christianity, but I suppose my understanding is that a kind of moral or theological explanation for that is the idea that the soul lives forever and that our bodies are only on earth for a limited time. And that is implicit in that, and I know, of course, there are very, very many different views within Christianity about that. Implicit in that is the idea that saving the soul, of course, can be more important than exhibiting compassion on earth. And of course, then there are incredibly important movements within Christianity that resist that. I'm very, conscious, for example, in a way I know more about Catholic history because of Catholic histories rather than Spain and Latin America. When I think of the Second Vatican Council and liberation theology and so on, and the priests and the nuns in Latin America who absolutely just, and also the movements in Spain under Catholic Action, who in the 50s and 60s just saw that in working class communities who were absolutely impoverished and living in the worst kind of misery, and the church was ignoring that, the church hierarchy was ignoring them. And these were the impetus, the lay Catholic movements who were really taking the Vatican II's understanding of Christ's compassion and taking it literally and putting it into practice. So there have been all sorts of kind of lay movements, but again, this is the kind of movement away often from the hierarchy and the institution, and it's certainly a rejection of any idea that there's a competition between saving one's soul and being compassionate to other people and creatures on earth. And to extend that out to animals, I'm very aware as well that within all of the major religions, there are people arguing that veganism and compassion towards animals is not only compatible with, but ultimately follows some of the main tenets of religious teaching. These, of course, are incredibly complex, but I know from my own background and also just my own kind of ethics, when I talk about what matters and what I feel responsible for, it's certainly about stopping suffering on earth. And it's not just stopping suffering, it's promoting thriving of people, thriving of other than human animals, and of course, thriving of the planet itself, which we also can't forget at this point in time. And that's when it all becomes a bit overwhelming, I have to confess, and think about what are we responsible for? What can we prioritize? How do we care for ourselves while caring for others? And these are huge questions, but this is when I, in a way, come back to feminism, because I think what feminism does is ask questions like that. Some kinds of feminism, but I think most feminism does ask questions like that. And a couple of things. One thing is not always coming back to the idea that it's women's responsibility to do all of this difficult caring work and the kind of ethical work. Men do the more kind of supposedly rational and work. And also just thinking about how these things work in practice and not just how they're interesting intellectual questions.
Just to wrap up on the religion and the supernatural side, I think you're right. There are many challenges in that way of thinking, because obedience to a deity or to the church can override positive ethics. I guess the classic story of Abraham and his son. He loved his son, but he was on the brink of killing him because God told him it was what he wanted him to do, which I think is a bizarre story. And there's other challenges of authority. There's in-group, out-group tribalism. There's rationales around, for example, non-human animals don't have souls and we have dominion over them, so we can do what we like. So there's all of those potential types of harm. But I think you're absolutely right to recognize that there's also many millions of religious people and movements within these religions that are trying to pull them towards a more universally compassionate ethic and try and modernize and jettison some of those more historical constraints, because it's quite obvious looking at many of them, they were written hundreds, if not thousands of years ago by some random man in the desert, and it's probably not the best ethical guide for us today. So there's enormous power in even movements within religions trying to move towards that more compassionate ethic. And I guess that's we started to come on to the second question of what matters, and you've talked already about harm and suffering and flourishing and oppression, and that was again something that flowed through quite strongly from your family's way of thinking about the world, and that activism as well. And one of the challenges that many people find when they move away from, or if they don't have a religious worldview, is that they're not sure how to ground their ethics. And that never sounds like it was a challenge for you, because you didn't start with that in the first place. But some people without that religious grounding might end up in a sort of nihilist approach where they're like, well, then nothing matters, right? If there isn't a judge, there isn't heaven, hell, then nothing matters. Others might go to a sort of extreme relativist approach where they say it's just up to different groups negotiating their norms, and that's the only meaning for morality. People like me come to something that is still grounded. For me, it's in the suffering and flourishing of other sentient beings. And it sounds like you have a similar sort of theme as well. But it'd be interesting to know, how would you say your morality is grounded now? What is important? What do good and bad mean for you morally?
Yeah, I mean,
but also how did that moral circle or that moral scope shift over time for you?
It's a fascinating question to me. And I do think, just coming back for a second to the question about institutional religions or religious dogma or rituals, guidelines, and so on, there are people who say, if you don't have that, if you don't have a kind of common set of beliefs and rules, basically, we think of Christianity, and of course these rules are interpreted, it will be just totally each one for themselves. Now, obviously, religion is an important, but it's not the only framework that gives us sets of values. So we have all sorts of other things. And I think it's important every once in a while to stop and think about, where did my sense of this come from, and to be conscious of that. Because if you aren't conscious of that, then you end up with a kind of non-thinking situation, which you're just doing the same thing. And soon you forget why it is that you're doing that. And I think I went through that for sure when I started doing veganism, stopped eating animals, and now trying to use animal products as little as possible. I find it hard to understand why it is that I did things mindlessly. So I guess that was an example of a rule that didn't exist for me. That there was no indication of what was okay to eat, what was food and what was not food. But I did follow mindlessly this idea that animals are food. And,
as nearly everybody does.
Shift, I had to become more mindful of that. But I do think that one of the ways in which there can be a kind of, I would call a more kind of conservative, sometimes it's a religious, sometimes it's a secular backlash against kind of what we might call social justice movements in the contemporary world, is this idea that it's all about liberal individualism. So we do what works for us, and we each choose individually. That's also problematic. I think it's important to have an individual ethics, to have it's really important to me to have a sense of who I am ethically and why I do things, and being willing to change when I confront new arguments or new evidence, because I know that Sentientism is also an evidence-based system of thought or morality, and I agree with the importance of evidence very much. But that's why I'm interested in thinking about what are these different things that have influenced me over my life. And I come back to, for example, feminism, and the ways in which I've had battles with myself with feminism. I don't think of it as being a faith, but I have to make sure that it doesn't become, because there are parts of feminism, or there's certain kinds of feminism or feminist arguments with which I disagree. And it would be a nightmare if I just mindlessly said, oh, this is what I learned patriarchy was and what gender was when I was a young woman. And that's still what I think all these years later. And so I think it is important to think about, for those of us who don't adhere to a particular religion, to be revising and understanding and thinking about where our values come from and where our sense of right and wrong comes from, and not just take it for granted, and also be wary of the extent to which we can set up authoritarian ways of thinking and belief systems that are not from institutional religion, but take on the kind of an air of dogma.
You can escape one dogma and end up trapping yourself in another.
And I know that sometimes that can come across as a slightly kind of simplistic way. And you lots of theories around that, around communism, for example, and previous lifetime, one of the many figures that I, was very attracted to and studied was a communist leader in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s called La Pasionaria, Dolores Iberri. And people used to talk about her basically as just being this woman who dressed in black and acted as a kind of maternal communist figure, kind of replacing the Catholicism of her youth with communism. That's much more complicated than that. This was someone who grew up working class. Most of her children died before they reached 5, I think. This was a woman grounded in material realities of intense poverty in early 20th century Spain. So it wasn't as simple as the fact that she just substituted her authoritarian Catholicism for an authoritarian communism. But that's not to say that there aren't ways in which political movements, which are ostensibly secular, don't mindlessly often integrate authoritarian aspects that we might associate or dogmatic tendencies from religion. And one of the things that I often wonder about, for example, is when people criticize veganism and vegans for being puritanical and focusing on the idea of sacrifice. So I think that in a predominantly Christian worldview, this idea of sacrifice is a very powerful one.
Yeah.
And it has different meanings. But it's one of the reasons I try, one of the reasons behind the book was to try to think about veganism as a form of pleasure and a form of embracing different kinds of consumption and different relations with animals as a form of extending pleasure, rather than this idea of denying and sacrificing. And so I'm always wary of vegans talking too much about the idea of veganism as being a moral baseline, for example. Someone like Gary Francione and Gary Steiner, who are two American vegan philosophers who I associate with that kind of language. I've learned a lot from both of them, and I'm sympathetic in many ways with the abolition animal rights position. But I'm not sympathetic with this idea of veganism as a moral baseline, because again, to me, it sounds too much like a kind of a dogma. It's impossible to follow. It's just, yeah. But again, without having done a kind of detailed study of it, my gut feeling is that some of this language reflects an influence of some of the more kind of angry God parts of Christianity that some, secular people who come from a Christian culture or even have been just raised in a predominantly Christian world, which is the West. Yeah, so it's interesting to think about how those kind of, I don't want to say entirely negative, because I'm sure there are ways, sacrifice is a very complicated concept, but I think vegans often get caught out in this kind of language. And listen, sometimes we can be, no matter how much I present myself as being the vegan who's emphasizing pleasure and fantasy above sacrifice, it doesn't matter. People still will say, oh, you're one of those vegans who's out there to your mission in life is to try to make me miserable.
Yeah. And I like the way you put it, because in a way it's taking that approach that you might think of as scientific and naturalistic when we're thinking about facts and understanding and knowledge, and never be too sure, always open to new evidence, always challenging yourself and being skeptical even of your own thinking, but do that in the moral sphere as well. Testing, why do I think that? Is that really right? What's at the root of it? I think that's very healthy.
I think it's one of the things that writing can do. It's one of the things that conversations like this can do. And I think there are lots of ways of doing that. But I think for a lot of us who write about the things that are kind of morally, ethically important to us, it's one of the ways of working out those questions, thinking through those questions. Certainly not the only thing that you're doing, but it's one of the things that I think that writing is super valuable for.
Yeah. And what was you've talked about it a little bit already, but what was your journey towards that moral scope question? Because I think most people would agree that, suffering is a bad thing, flourishing is a good thing, and we should have compassion. The problem is, okay, which entities do we grant compassion to? So even racists, often they love their mothers and their families. They have compassion, right? Sure. So the problem is that their compassion is restricted. Yeah. So in a way, I think that it's almost trite to say it, but almost every human-caused problem is either because people believe something that isn't true, they just misunderstood reality in the world, and that leads them into doing harm that doesn't need to be done, or it's a failure of compassion because people have set their scope of compassion too narrowly and therefore excluded others or deprecated others. So I'm interested in your journey on that side? Because it sounds like from your upbringing and that activism, and there was already a strong sense of anti-oppression and broad solidarity, at least with the humans in your community. But over time, your scope of moral considerability is broadened out to, other groups of humans. You talked about Indigenous rights, for example, but also to non-humans as well. So it'd be interesting to know your journey on broadening that scope of moral consideration, and particularly the non-human animal part of the journey.
Yeah, and I think it was partly through spending more and more time with vegetarians, and particularly vegans, and people for whom that was a pretty big part of their lives. And also through, in the kind of immediate, before I became, I stopped eating animal products, which is about 7 years, just over 7 years ago. I did go through quite a long period where I was doing a lot of meditation, which was influenced more by a kind of Buddhist tradition, and without particularly delving into Buddhism. I think that was a crucial part of the process.
Yeah.
I think it could have been, didn't necessarily have to be that, but I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, I would say that involved absolutely a kind of process of slowing down and mindfulness.
Yeah.
And I think, and this connects as well to, this was while I was still an academic, and it would be maybe 5 more years before I left my academic career. But I think that running alongside the conversation we're having is a reality of the contemporary consumer capitalist society in which we live, and in which, before the pandemic, I suppose the pandemic has also been a period of some slowing down for those of us who don't work in hospitals, for example. But this kind of sense of, it's very difficult to make, I think, big life decisions when you're just constantly going like this, which is why one of the things that activists talk about burnout, I think that's a really important conversation to have, because I think burnout can lead to a lot of things. It can, make people dogmatic. It makes people drop altogether. It makes people go from being very involved to something to being not involved in it at all, because it's destroyed their bodies and their minds through overwork and exhaustion. And so I think that was one of the things. I think a whole series of, I did write a bit about it in my book, just kind of explaining that a whole series of things in the kind of running up to a decision to stop eating animals. And then I just basically did it overnight. But it really was about becoming more mindful. And a book that I cite quite a bit was an anthology by a woman named Amy Breeze Harper, called Sister Vegan, which is a series of Black American women, I think it's from about 2010, writing about their very different experiences of going vegan for all sorts of kind of spiritual health and animal rights and environmentalist and other reasons. But a number of the authors in that book, they came from different spiritual traditions to mine, either African-centered and or Christianity. This common theme of kind of seeing things start to come together and having the time and place and the mindfulness to be able to make those connections. I think
just having the mental and emotional space to be able to.
Absolutely. I really think it's one of the reasons why, I think there are all sorts of reasons why people should not work so much, and why people need time and space to sniff the flowers, to use that cliche. But one of them is, I think for ethical reasons, and especially in a consumer society, that I think that is just telling us to consume and consume mindlessly constantly. I think it's very difficult to step back, get out of that, and think seriously about what we're doing without the time and space to do it. And I really do think that's why we need a shorter work week. That's why we need universal basic income and all those things that would support us to thrive, and then be able to be good humans at the same time.
I think it's a really interesting combination, because I think you're right. One, that space to introspect and to challenge and to think makes us more likely to understand things accurately, but gives us the space to be more moral and to be better. But it's also a direct improvement of our own sentient experience, which for me is ultimately what everything comes back to. It's all about the quality of not just my sentient experience, but yours, but all other sentient beings. And in a way, that's our own is the one we can affect most directly, and it's something we shouldn't neglect. As you say, issues of burnout, you in practical terms, you just can't take the pressures of the entire world on your shoulders. You have to recognize you're a sentient being too. Your experience matters, and you need to look after yourself.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's
And
part
so
of
that
universal
relationship
compassion.
and that compassion for self, and this kind of relationship between caring for ourselves and caring for others. One of the I've talked a bit about my relationship to feminism, and one of the areas of feminism I feel somewhat ambivalent about is the ethics of care, partly because I think it does come from, especially really in the American tradition, the US tradition, from a kind of maternal feminism, which sets off alarm bells for me, because I think there's always that risk that once again, people who are identified as women will be called upon to be the mothers of the world.
Yeah, who's going to be doing the caring? Guess who?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly the question. At the same time, I think the turn to care is partly a response to the realities of our contemporary consumerist capitalist culture. And it is related to questions of compassion. And it interests me that there's so much talk about care and feminism without there being as much talk as there could be about care for other animals. And yet I can see when I start to make that argument, and I had a whole chapter in my book called Caring for Others or something like that, Caring Across Species or something like that, which really looked very hard at this question. We can't care for ourselves or care for others without somehow doing it through the bodies and lives of other creatures. And so this whole idea that we can't, by feeding ourselves, by feeding members of our families or companion animals, that's a huge ethical dilemma, isn't it? To deal with making sure that our companion animals are not harming the very farm animals that we've committed ourselves not to harming. These are incredibly complex issues.
Yeah.
But I think thinking of care as something that interdependent, and thinking of ourselves as in a way, our care of ourselves always involves relations with others, and how can those be mutually caring and not exploitative and not instrumentalizing. Yeah. I think
it's a powerful perspective.
And that language I've really picked up from, I don't know if you're familiar with her, and I wish she were cited more in contemporary vegan circles, is the late Australian ecofeminist Val Plumwood. And Val Plumwood is really, she's great. She wrote Feminism and the Mastery of Nature. Is that the name for kind of a key ecofeminist book from the 80s? Mm. But Plum was a really and she died 10 or 15 years ago, I think. And I'm not sure that she defined herself as vegan, but she really, her argument and one of her kind of disagreements with both American ecofeminists and also with Peter Singer and some of the people who emphasized the idea that you draw a line somewhere in sentientism and the sentient creatures belong to you, are more universe and the others didn't, was that it's still creating a kind of binary. And she stressed very much that the issue is not so much whether we consume other animals, or indeed whether other animals consume us. And that's a crucial part of her argument, that we need to think of ourselves as being potential prey. Yeah. The issue is whether we're instrumentalizing and exploiting animals solely for our own use. And I have found that a really compelling argument. Also, I don't believe in farming animals at all. I don't think it's necessary, nor will it begin to solve the issue of, feeding a world of 9 billion people, which I think is an issue, and without burning the planet. That's an issue we need to take really seriously. I don't see how we can be ethically responsible for 9 billion human beings and still eat farm animals. It's not compatible, those two positions. Even if you weren't vegan, even if you didn't care about animals, it's a totally incompatible position. Yeah. But I found her argument, and that to me is what the issue with factory farming ultimately is. And I think Peter Singer basically says this also in Animal Liberation, by the way. So he acknowledged in Animal Liberation 1975 that the big thing we're facing, the big moral dilemma for human beings vis-a-vis animals, is factory farming. Yeah. It's an abomination.
It's the big beast, isn't it? And I think
it is the absolute big beast. And I'm not saying we shouldn't work on anything else. Fishing. Obviously, the overfishing and the incredibly exploitative fishing. But it's this idea that the only reason farm animals exist, the only reason, their sole reason for existing, is to feed human beings food that we don't need to eat. Yeah. There is just no way that you can, under any moral framework, justify that.
No, it's deeply shocking. Yeah. And one of the, I like the way you frame that, Carrie, because I think that can play through really strongly. And it's another one of these moral approaches that is already richly applied within our own species. And it, to my mind, seems really quite simple just to extend it out to incorporate sentient beings in our scope as well. And in a way, that's part of the intention behind Sentientism, is that it almost deliberately sidesteps the really tricky questions about what should your moral system be, and your challenging question, who should we be responsible to and what should we be responsible for. It says, look, those are really difficult, complex, challenging things, but the most important thing is to set the boundary of our moral consideration correctly. And once we've done that, we can then discuss within that context whether you apply virtue ethics or some sort of utilitarian approach or consequentialism or deontological rules or a feminist care ethic or whatever you like. There's all sorts of different ways of granting moral consideration, but let's at least make sure that all sentient beings are in that scope as we work out what to do. And I think it also links to your approach to veganism, in that it also doesn't say, here's a perfect answer to every situation. Here's a perfect answer to every trolley problem or every conflict of interest. There may be no perfect answer. There may be no good answer. There may be answers that still involve harming and killing sentient beings. But at least in the work you do, you have to grant full consideration to every single one of those sentient beings, because the worst harms are done when you exclude an entity. So it does leave space for really difficult ethical challenges or where interests conflict. And it doesn't suggest an answer to that, but it just says, you at least have to count all sentient beings in your moral calculus. So in a way, I like the fact that leaves an enormous space for a dizzying pluralism of other approaches you can layer on top of it. But it focuses on what I see as the most important basic thing, which is just don't exclude any being that can suffer.
And what about beings that, and I'm afraid that I'm probably behind in the scientific discussions about where we draw the line with sentience. Yeah. I know that, again, because I talk about it in my book, I know Singer moved the line a bit while he was between his first and second editions of Animal Liberation, from shrimps to oysters. But I also think about the role of oysters, for example, in filtering water. And in thinking about the planet, and then I do think we have an ethical obligation to not to let the planet burn for its own sake, not just for the survival of the human species, although I do think, that is important also. I don't know, where would you talk about that in terms of without going too far to say you need to extend moral consideration to water? What about those beings who might not be sentient, but, for example, play an important, coral reefs, for example, play an important role in filtering oxygen and so on?
So sentientism doesn't have a list of which types of species or entities are sentient. It just says, follow the science and be prudent about it. So it's another area where many sentientists will disagree about exactly where to put that boundary. So some will include oysters, and I would myself, just to be prudent. Others will be comfortable excluding them. There are some types of really basic animals like sea sponges that have no nervous system at all. So I'm pretty confident they're not sentient. So people disagree, and sentientism doesn't have an answer. My personal answer, based on a sort of amateurish reading of the science, is that it pretty much overlaps with animals, pretty much. There might be some super simple invertebrates, like the sea sponge and so on, that aren't sentient, but otherwise we should give them, oh, hello, there's a sentient being.
She's a sentient being who's been dying to join our conversation for some time.
Lovely.
So I thought we better let her up.
What's her name?
This is Zora.
Hello, Zora.
Okay.
Luna is still asleep behind me. They look quite similar, actually.
I saw Luna before. I think she's a bit smaller. Zora's also a rescue, and she's a terrier, so we'll see how long she lasts. Anyway, many scientists disagree. That's where I'd set the boundary pretty much myself. Again, always open to new evidence, always uncertain, provisional, probabilistic, and I'd argue, let's be prudent, because the potential to cause harm if we get that boundary wrong is pretty serious. But if you flag another interesting question about, okay, what about the things we're really confident aren't sentient? And I would include in that, again, some others would disagree, plants, rocks, rivers, water, the planet as a whole. And there are different schools of thought there, because some people do explicitly and directly and intrinsically grant those things moral significance as well, in their own right, independent of their impact on any sentient being. And those people might call themselves a biocentrist for plants, for living things, and an ecocentrist for pretty much everything, really. I guess I take a view that recognizes those things are deeply important, but only because of their impact on all the sentient beings. So the reason I care about pollution in a lake or the quality of the air or the depth of a glacier isn't because I think that thing intrinsically has moral value in its own right.
It's because all of the sentient beings, human and non-human, have critical webs of interdependencies that mean we need a healthy planet to live on. So that's why I don't a remote planet around a distant star with no life on it at all has any moral value, but in its own, it would only have value if there were sentient beings that relied on it or had a dependency on it. So I'd care about the same things, but for a slightly different reason. And part of the reason I do that is that many people, and I would suggest this is where the center of gravity of the modern environmental movement is, recognizes rich, deep importance to the entire environment, Gaia as a system and species and habitats and ecosystems and rocks and rivers, while still carving out from their moral consideration vast trillions of very obviously sentient animals. And what that exposes to me is that their ecocentrism is really just, one of my earlier guests described it as a veneer on anthropocentrism. Really, it's just another way of saying this is what matters to us humans. So we can continue.
Because they ignore farm animals, you mean?
Yeah, for example. So they'll say, look, I care, we should give rights to rivers, but I can still have my bacon sandwich. And I'm so to my mind, I don't mind if people want to go beyond that and say, look, no, that river actually has intrinsic moral value. I'm like, I disagree. I think it's instrumental, but that's fine. But please don't exclude any of the sentient beings as you go out expanding your moral scope. Don't leave these very obviously sentient beings out of your consideration. So that's part of my hesitation about that biocentric or ecocentric perspective that goes beyond sentience.
Yeah. And I guess one of my, in turn, hesitations around sentientism is my concern that it's still it still draws on a very European philosophical tradition.
Maybe.
And so that's not a reason for disagreeing with it.
Yeah.
But without aware of the,
I've had that happen.
Very much aware of the risks of what we might call cultural appropriation. I'm very committed to learning more about, particularly from the Canadian, North American Indigenous traditions, about worldviews that, for example, that would incorporate, whether it be kind of person status, and I'm not even sure that morality or moral consideration is the right language. And that wouldn't, and as I said, those aren't the traditions I come from, although my whole existence has, relied upon an exploitation of those traditions. So that's also part of my own awareness and my own responsibilities. For example, I'm trying to think of some of the potential consequences of talking about animals that we're very sure are sentient. For example, seals.
Yeah.
No, there's no doubt that seals are sentient creatures, and seals are at the center of an ecosystem and used for food and for many other things, clothing, oil, and so on, among the Inuk, the Inuit populations of northern Canada. And without knowing nearly enough about that tradition, I do know two things. One is that I think that this is an example where Plumwood's idea of instrumentalization is really instructive, because I don't think the relationship between Inuk humans and seals is one of instrumentalization. The seals in the Arctic have their full lives, and they're not there with the sole purpose of serving those communities, even if they do end up eventually being hunted and used for food and so on. And I'm also conscious that there was a moment in Canadian history in the 1970s and the 1980s, which certain environmental groups, including Greenpeace, were very active in making the lives of Inuit people and other First Nations people and First Nations people in Canada hell, because of an argument about that seals were, that the main thing was to make sure that seals weren't hunted. And that was does that make sense? Does that make sense?
It does.
I'm working through for myself how I can understand relationships between human beings and animals that are something other than instrumental. And I think the reason that I struggle with it is because the culture I grew up in overwhelmingly has instrumentalized the animals that I've eaten. And by the way, I really am thinking very strictly in terms of particular cultures. I wouldn't for a second use this argument to defend fox hunting, for example. And not just because foxes aren't eaten by whoever hunts them in the UK, but also just because fox hunting is part of a tradition, which to me encapsulates the worst of the kind of instrumentalization of the world. That is the aristocratic British tradition. But I don't know if I'm making it. So I guess one of my wariness around Sentientism is just being conscious of how it can be misused in ways that recolonize rather than decolonize.
Yeah, agree. I think that's a valid concern. And I guess one thing I'd say is that it's been fascinating digging into these ideas, right? On the one side, naturalism, and the other side, this sentiocentric compassion. Because they can seem quite modern ideas. The term sentiocentrism or sentientism has only been around since the 1970s. And there's also this sense that naturalism, is associated with humanism and atheism. And people think that was invented in the Enlightenment in Europe, which is just bullshit, frankly.
Right.
And as you dig into the history of both of those things, right, both a naturalistic way of thinking that has deep ancient roots in Asian philosophies and in Arab philosophy and African philosophy, but also in a sentiocentric compassion. They didn't use that word, but if you look at the concepts of ahimsa that runs through Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism, if you look at Rastafarianism, as you look at many indigenous cultures, they actually did have this sense that these non-humans have their own experiences. They can experience suffering. That matters. And an ahimsa deliberately says, and therefore harming them is something we should try and avoid doing. So I'm quite relaxed that the concept of sentientism actually has very deep, ancient, global, very diverse roots. But you're absolutely right. We've got to be very careful. It isn't then reframed and presented as, here's another middle-aged white guy who's got this idea he's trying to push on to other people's.
Or middle-aged white woman.
Yeah,
and I guess one of the keys here is the question of whether all killing involves suffering, and whether what the relationship is between use, the difference between use and instrumentalization.
Yeah.
And I guess, again, I have found, I think probably there are some Indigenous vegan writers who I think are really interesting on these points. And I've also learned, again, a lot from Val Plumwood on this. And I think, so these questions, the assumption that, I guess I'll say that. And I think, again, coming back to the point about factory farming, I think there's a recognition that while the suffering of animals who are killed on factory farms is terrible, the way they're killed is torturous and makes them suffer. Their entire lives are one big suffering.
Yeah. And I think this, again, comes back to one of the things you touched on before, is that I don't think there is a dogmatic answer here where you explicitly say all of this is wrong and all of this is right. Often there are grey areas and different interests that trade off. A non-vegan, for example, would say, look, you're telling me dogmatically factory farming is wrong, but my pleasure counts, right? So we need to offset my pleasure against the suffering of that chicken and that pig and that fish. Yeah. And in my moral judgment, my pleasure wins out. Now, you and I would disagree with them, but there are still different pros and cons. So, and I think you can play that through into the different scenarios. And I think one area where I think I would challenge even Indigenous cultures, I don't think they're the focus, because when you look at factory farming and what a Western colonial mindset has done to animal agriculture, again, that's the big beast, that's the focus, that's the priority. If you just look at the scale of suffering, it's mind-blowing, and the waste and the environmental destruction and the risk to human health. It's just, so that's absolutely clear, right? And I do find it very frustrating when people will, so you start to question their motivation, right? If someone only looks at the Yulin Dog Meat Festival, right? Or they only look at Inuit seal hunting, or they only look at, while they are still happy participating in factory farming, there's a hint there that there's something different that's driving their motivation. Yeah. Whereas I think the motivation we should have is to have a moral consideration for all sentient beings. But what that does mean for me is that I can respect Indigenous traditions, and I can recognize that they're in a very different situation of need and priority, right? This isn't just a transient taste preference that is leading someone to hunt a seal on the ice pack if they want to continue living there. It's a matter of survival, right? It's a very different moral trade-off, if you like, that you could argue about. But what I would say is that even in that situation, we still have to have moral consideration for the seal or for the hunted wild boar. That their perspective does matter. I wouldn't make a pronouncement about whether that practice is right or wrong, but I still do think there's a moral negative in the suffering and death of that being. And I think this may be where we slightly disagree, because the reason I don't like instrumentalization is because the instrumentalization causes the suffering. Whereas I think you have a challenge to the instrumentalization in itself. Whereas I think whether you're instrumentalized or not, the seal doesn't care. The seal and its family doesn't care whether it's being that perspective shift that I guess.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I suppose that the instrumentalization, for me, the reason it becomes a kind of moral issue, and this connects with the hypothetical and yet very all too real person that you talk about says, yeah, so what, the cow and the pig are suffering, but my desire to eat
most people on the planet, yeah.
hamburger is more important. That is such a totally anthropocentric worldview that I find it very difficult for it to be anything other than immoral or possibly amoral.
And I think if you can get to the point where you say, I am willing to pay someone to have a sentient being harmed and killed because of my taste preference, you've basically giving it zero moral consideration.
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
a trade-off anymore. If you did that to a human, you wouldn't say, oh, I give them some consideration, I just like the taste of flesh. You would say, no, you've given them zero moral, you've excluded them, right? That's
right.
the problem. Sorry,
and I think that then leads to that kind of level of self-centered anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
Is so much, is at the root of so many of our problems in the world that I guess that's where my alarm bell would go off and think that either this person is being deliberately provocative. And of course, that's part of the problem of being vegan is that you end up with these kind of deliberately, you wish you were a fly on the wall when there are no vegans around. What do they talk about? Do non-vegans talk about animal rights when they're just on their own? I have no idea, probably not. But it'd be interesting because they seem to be very much prompted to talk about it when we're around, but what they say. So obviously sometimes they're deliberately provocative. I think that most people just don't think about it very much, but they're obviously being forced to think more and more about it, just as the current or just past heat wave crisis in the west of North America has hopefully prompted people to think a bit more about their own actions that lead to climate change. So I don't know whether you want to call it a cognitive disconnect, but I think that you're right, that we can't discount that there are people for whom eating animals actually is a moral act because it reaffirms what to them is a moral stance, which is that human beings are morally superior entities. Those arguments are difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I agree.
Because I think which I don't see as the same argument as saying that, those kind of arguments they have in ethics classes and philosophy. If there's a house burning, do you say 6 dogs or 1 child? Yeah. When I hear those kinds of arguments, I think a bit about what Bridget Brophy, the English animal rights activist, said something along the lines of, and she made a joke about how she would, if she were a bit younger, she'd have no trouble eating her, great Aunt Emily after her death and her kind of some meatball soup or something like that. Yeah. But she said, because of the way I was raised, I probably wouldn't be able to do that. And she said it in much more lyrical way than that. But I think sometimes it's unreasonable. I have no idea. What if I'd been raised in a totally non-anthropocentric worldview? I don't know what I think. I think it's impossible having been raised in the world that I was raised in. That's Luna.
Yeah, give me 1 second. She wants me to go over and play. Yeah.
And I think I just have no idea. I think I was, again, I'm not blaming this on anyone, but I do think that there are cultures in the world that are much less anthropocentric. And then so I'm conscious as well that the idea that I could get to a point where I would say that I think that the life of my dog is worth the exact same as the life of my mother, for example. I mean, even saying it feels like it. I just think it's impossible. We can only move away so far from the worldviews in which we're.
Yeah, and I think there's still space to prioritize. So I'm talking about setting the moral consideration to include all sentient beings. That doesn't necessarily. Some would say that we should try and treat them all as equal. But I think there's space to justify prioritizing within that, your family, friends, circles, things we can influence, problems that are tractable. I think there's all sorts of reasons why you might prioritize within that. Again, my excuse for dodging all the difficult problems is just saying, let's focus on that boundary and then we can work out the priorities in it. But it doesn't have to be a totally radical egalitarianism that says, I would flip a coin to decide whether to save a human child or a chicken from the burning building. We don't need to be there. We just need to have consideration for them both.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean the answers are easy.
Yes. And I think that you've explained it very well, and I'm understanding it. The idea that, yes, having consideration, and this brings me back exactly to factory farming, there's clearly no consideration whatsoever. And which is when we get into the murky territory about locavorism and rewilding. And again,
wild animal suffering.
It gets into wild animal suffering. And I think that also this is where I would add to our other concerns, this idea in a capitalist society, the commodification of animals. So I don't need to commodify animals in order to eat. So why would I commodify them even on a kind of small farm? But I understand people's arguments that there may be ways of raising animals on farms for food, which acknowledge their moral status, which takes into all those kinds of considerations. My counter argument there is that we don't need that. And again, it would feed such a tiny percentage of humanity that why on earth would we waste our time with such an elite niche enterprise when we need more chickpeas?
And I also disagree that it's possible in a sense, because even if we don't grant non-human animals the same moral consideration as human, I think granting a non-human animal any moral consideration means that we wouldn't harm it or constrain it or kill it because we like the taste of its flesh. And I just don't, to me, that is zero moral consideration. So even if you're on a super nice free range, supposedly ethical farm, as soon as we take the perspective of that sentient being and its family, there's the answer, right? It doesn't, in a way, on the fateful day when it comes, it doesn't really care whether it's in a free range farm and it's lived 7/8 of its life, or if it's in a factory farm and it's lived 1/10 of its life. It's still going to get electrocuted and have its throat cut, and it doesn't want that. And it's that perspective shift that.
And it's existing purely for human.
For trivial, transient, needless preferences. I just don't see an answer to it. But I agree that, again, the priority, we just keep being drawn back to the big beast of fishing and factory farming. But I'm aware I've taken so much of your time already, but it's been a fascinating conversation.
It's very enjoyable.
If you're all right for a little bit longer, the final section of the conversation, which we've touched on to some degree already, is, okay, given all of that, what do we think about the future? So I think we're with many of my guests, we're in a strange situation where I think we're reasonably comfortable with a sort of naturalistic way of understanding the world. We're reasonably comfortable with a morality that recognizes the moral salience of human and non-human animals and sentient beings, and that we might disagree over the priorities and we might disagree over many ethical questions, but we think they should all count morally when we're working out what's the right thing to do. But we live in a world where most of the 8 billion people on the planet disagree with us on one or both of those things. Their ethics are driven by some form of supernatural, somewhat arbitrary, often 2,000-year-old ethic, and their morality is radically constrained in many ways. So, many people around the world, as we know, don't grant full moral consideration even to all humans, let alone to non-humans. So we're in this weird situation where it feels technically like the answer, at least the basics, aren't that difficult to work out. But most people on the planet disagree with us. And we have this pattern, as you said, of social norms and, in a sense, social indoctrination that keeps people in these patterns. And not enough people have the psychological or emotional freedom that you talked about before to test and evaluate and challenge the way we think. So in that sort of frustrating context, how does that leave you feeling about the future?
I have to say, I feel I have I don't think that much about the future in those senses. I think this is the historian in me. I think we can inform the future, absolutely. And I think the future is obviously the unknown, but it's not. I think one thing history teaches you is that history is not inevitable. The future is not inevitable. So I have two views. One is that I really do think we're living through a watershed moment. I think we haven't much talked about the different reasons that people would do veganism, but I think that what's really clear is that there is an increasing awareness of the need to recognize the moral status of farmed animals, and also to recognize that animal agriculture is a noose around.
How many reasons do we need?
Destroy the planet. It's just going to destroy the planet. And I think there is a moment. I think there are conversations. I think it has all sorts of, it does have to do with evidence of climate change. It does have to do with, I think the amazing thing about social media, I think it has to do with millennials growing up in a different environment and being super enthusiastic about changing the world. And I do think that. I'm also aware rationally that we're working against the clock. So on the one hand, I see this future in which these things are changing very quickly, and in which things are going to be different in 10 or 20 years, radically different. On the other hand, I'm not sure there's going to be enough time. So there is a part of me that does see a kind of apocalyptic, world-burning future, and I'm not one of those people who thinks that's a great thing. I know there are some people for whom the apocalyptic,
the rapture,
is very exciting, and it's very Blade Runner, and it's all like, it's one of my favorite movies ever. All of those things that are very living in it. But those kind of moments that I think a lot of us lived through at the very first stages of the pandemic, of thinking, oh my God, are we just all going to be wiped out by this virus? And I realized at that moment that I did not welcome the idea of living in a post-apocalyptic movie.
Yeah.
Me, my dog,
it would shock some people, but I think suffering and death are bad things. So you would think that's obvious, but
this is it. And so I really think that just realistically, I think one of the things I wonder for myself is how much I'll live to see in terms of either one of those scenarios, either the nightmare scenario or the I guess the dream scenario, in that there's a greater amount of consciousness around a topic that we've only touched on briefly, is the kind of nature of capitalism. I'm not hugely optimistic about the ability of capitalism to reform itself. I think that, although I'm also not hugely optimistic about the inevitable goodness and progress of revolutions, I just don't see how, given that capitalism is the thing that's driving animal agriculture, how this is going to happen within our existing system. Because we just get too much talk about reform. And I think that's the one thing that vegans are. We're not interested in reforming of animal agriculture any more than prison abolitionists are interested in reforming a prison system. And our institutions and phenomena that are just absolutely so destructive that the only thing that will get to solve the problem is to get rid of them and replace them with something else. In the case of animal agriculture, we just replace it with, nothing, basically.
Haven't these people heard of plants?
Yeah, this is it. So, and
that's been one of the fascinating things about building some of the communities around this idea of sentientism, is the radical breadth of political opinion as well. Because there are some people who think that we can work within capitalist structures to shift incentives, corporate and individual, and government and regulation and taxation and subsidies, to shift the machine and the corporations to a very different place. There are others who think that we need a complete radical overhaul. It's interesting, there are people they have a naturalistic worldview and they have a sentiocentric compassion, who are communists and neoliberals, social democrats, even some people who are economically quite conservative, but socially very liberal and compassionate. So there are so many different ways of trying to get to that compassionate aim, and I don't pretend to have the answer either. But the answers have to have a strong political element to them, right? It can't just be theory. We have to work out what to do and how to do it.
Yeah. And I guess just because capitalism, the whole kind of philosophy and impulse behind capitalism is growth and profits, and I just don't see how. I can understand, on a practical, I understand theoretically how people can say, well, we'll just shift to make soy more profitable, or I understand that. And I also think that at the end of the day, with the profit motive acts as a huge deterrent for people thinking morally. I think that, and there's just evidence for that throughout.
I agree. And I think that's another interesting positive thing that I think is happening even within the current capitalist structure, is that is being challenged, because there's been this strong theme that what corporations need to do to benefit the world and society generally is just to focus on the money. And I think people are, even within the established corporations and the institutions, are now challenging that and saying, why is that the case? Corporations are just another way human beings collaborating. Human beings have ethics. So why shouldn't the corporations have ethics and purpose and values? And there's a lot of bullshit there, right? There's greenwashing and ethics washing and clever marketing. But I think there is also some genuine shift going on there as well. There's leaders of these companies and the employees of these companies and the consumers of the companies and the shareholders. There's a shift. Whether it's enough, whether it's fast enough, we should absolutely be skeptical. But there is something genuine happening there, even within the current machine.
There is definitely shifts happening, but I don't know what's going to replace our contemporary capitalist system, but it's taking us fast to hell if we don't overthrow it, I think.
Yeah. And as you've said, we just, in a way, there's hope there too, but we need to give ourselves, enough breathing space to capitalize on it, rather than heading off the cliff before we get a chance to turn it around.
Exactly.
So that was a really interesting balance of dread and worry, but also some hope and joy and potential.
The dread and worry freak me out too much, because I think that you can't be an activist if you're caught in this idea of dread and worry all the time, or you're a different kind of activist. I guess a kind of ultra-conservative position is we need to hold off change as much as possible. And that's a kind of negative way of, I don't think that kind of negative thinking is in any way.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I want to ask you one more question before I let you go, because sorry, we're coming up almost on a couple of hours. And that final question is, as we think about the political, and we've talked a lot about non-human animal ethics and animal farming, but we've touched on other forms of oppression and challenges even within our own species. Do you have a sense about how those things intersect? Because you've written very richly on the links between different forms of oppression and different forms of solidarity and human and non-human challenges, and whether they should be treated as separate things or linked or integrated. How do you think about all of those different things? Are they a list of separate problems to work on together? Are they richly integrated? Are they complementary?
They're richly integrated, but I also realize that I have my own priorities. Yeah. So, for example, I can recognize that someone else's priority is, let's just take an example. I've been thinking a bit about talking to people recently, what's happening in Colombia and certain parts of Latin America at the moment. I'm not engaged in that whatsoever, not because I'm not interested or I don't care. I don't think it's incredibly important to not only people there, but because that's not the focus that I'm on. So I guess the approach that I would have is to kind of keep things in mind, keep learning, be aware of connections, and also really crucially, especially from someone who comes from as privileged a background as I do, and someone who's from a white Christian background, I'm always listening to other people's perspectives and the experiences and worldviews of people who are more oppressed or marginalized in ways that I'm not, which does not mean that I need to agree with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't mean that they can't also in other ways oppress me, and so on and so forth. But I think that does include with my approach to veganism. I listen to why other people choose not to be vegan, why it's not a priority for them. For example, I'm very conscious of the arguments that I heard someone recently make on our hen house, and just saying it's very difficult. This is a Black minister, vegan himself, Christian minister, Baptist, I think, talking about going into African-American communities in his parish and so on, and saying people are really dealing with the day-to-day survival issues. Of course, you're going to approach the issue of animal rights, if they're not already vegan, from a different perspective. Yeah, and that's not the work that I need to be doing. So I would say that it's being aware that there's a combination of my own experience and priorities, and also the emergencies of the moment that I bring things together. But I will be honest in saying I'm increasingly unsatisfied with anyone who has any degree of privilege and claims to be doing social justice work who has no time whatsoever for veganism. If they say that they do have time for veganism for X, Y, Z reason, they can't prioritize it or do it, then that's fine. Yeah. But just to dismiss it as some kind of, that's an argument which I did have time for when I started doing veganism. And I feel like if there's one thing that longer I've been veganism, I don't have. Yeah. It's an integral part of social justice movements. And I think that I'm on the right side of history with that. I think most people recognize that now.
I think so too. And there's a distinction in my mind between choosing where to prioritize and actually being involved explicitly in the commission of an oppression.
Absolutely.
And I think that's an important distinction. So if someone was to say to me, I'm not going to go out and help this group of non-human animals directly because I want to prioritize some sort of human social justice concern, I'd acknowledge that, right? We all prioritize. But if someone says, I'm going to continue focusing on this human social justice concern while explicitly paying money into a system that is going to cause needless harm and suffering and death to another sentient, you wouldn't accept that in a human sphere of influence either, right? You wouldn't deliberately allow someone to go and hurt another group of humans because they were prioritizing elsewhere. There's a distinction there. And I think we've touched on some of these themes, right? It's about having that broad moral consideration. So at least everybody, including non-human sentients, counts morally. Whether or not you're in a position to help them, they still count. You just don't discount them.
Yeah.
Listen, to your point, what's important is their perspective. Again, non-human or human, it's their perspective, their worldview, their way of thinking, what's important to them, their experience that's important. To the degree we can judge that, it's always imperfect, right? Even you and I can't perfectly understand each other, but we can at least try. And then that final thing is having that compassion for yourself as well, and looking after yourself too. I think and then not pretending there's easy answers to these problems in many cases. So.
Exactly. As much as we'd love to.
Yeah. And it comes back to your earlier point about just always questioning, always giving yourself space to keep thinking. And maybe that's a good way to wrap up.
Absolutely. Wow, great. Thank you so much, Jamie. This has been really fascinating.
I've loved the conversation. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Learning. I'm a teacher, but I think I'm a student at heart. So there we go.
Likewise, I've learned a great deal from you in the last couple of hours. Well, what's the best way of people following you, learning, learning more from you, buying your book?
both on Instagram and Twitter, and I have a blog, Veganism, Sex and Politics. That's a way to look me up, just those 3 words or 4 words. And I publish, so my book, Veganism, Sex and Politics, is published by Hammer on Intellect Press in 2019. So you can find that easily. I've got that blog, and also, follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And
That's brilliant. Thank you. I'll include links in the show notes as well, so people can.
Great. Thanks very much. It's been great to meet you. And I do hope we get to meet in person sometime.
I hope so too. We're both in the same time zone, so maybe we can continue the learning from each other over a beer at some point.
Exactly. That'd be fantastic. And now you can go and play with Luna. I'm sure she's dying to.
I think so. Yeah. I think she's getting desperate.
Right.
It's been a genuine pleasure. Thank you so much.
Right.
Stay in touch. Thanks, Carrie.
Okay. Bye.